The first time I met Daniel's father, I knew something wasn't right. The air in the dining room of their suburban Boston home was too stiff, too judgmental, as if the walls themselves had been trained to look down on people like me. I sat there in a modest black dress, my hands folded tightly in my lap, while Daniel's father, Richard, studied me the way a man studies a stain on his expensive shirt. "Street garbage," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. My fork froze midair. For a moment, I thought maybe I misheard, but then I caught the smirk on his face, the satisfied curl of his lip, and I knew he meant every syllable. Daniel's mother, Elaine, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel himself didn't even notice at first. He was too busy telling a story about his work at the firm, his voice light and eager, trying to impress his father the way he always did. It wasn't until I set my fork down with a quiet clink that Daniel's eyes darted toward me. "You okay, Claire?" he asked softly. I forced a smile, though my stomach churned. "I'm fine, but I wasn't fine. Not even close." Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass like a king who had just dismissed a servant. He wanted me to hear. He wanted me to feel small. And in that moment, I realized two things. One, he saw me as nothing more than a girl from the wrong side of town, something beneath his wealthy, carefully polished world. And two, men like Richard had never met women like me. I wasn't the type to stay quiet forever. Dinner dragged on, a blur of expensive wine and roasted duck. But my mind replayed that one word over and over again: street garbage, like my entire existence could be summed up in two cruel syllables. My childhood, my mother working double shifts at the diner, the scholarship that got me through college, the late nights I spent building a career in marketing, none of it mattered to him. To him, I would always be nothing. After dessert, I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door, leaned against the counter, and stared at my reflection. My chest rose and fell in sharp breaths. My lipstick had faded, my eyes were glassy, but beneath all that was a fire burning hotter than ever. Revenge wasn't the word I thought of that night. Not yet. Back then, it was more of a quiet promise to myself. If Richard wanted to see me as nothing, then someday, somehow, I would show him how dangerous nothing could be. When I returned to the table, Daniel was clearing plates with his mother. Richard sat alone, tapping on his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He thought he'd already won, but he hadn't. He had just started a game he didn't even know he was playing. That night, when Daniel drove me back to my apartment, he reached for my hand. "I'm sorry if Dad was a little harsh." "A little harsh?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. He frowned. "He can be difficult. He judges everyone. It's not just you." I stared out the window as Boston's lights blurred past. "He called me street garbage, Daniel." "That's not just difficult. That's who he is." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "I'll talk to him." "No," I said quickly. "Don't. Not yet." Because in my mind, I wasn't interested in Daniel's apologies or his father's half-hearted excuses. What I wanted was bigger. I wanted Richard to choke on his own arrogance. I wanted him to realize one day that the woman he had dismissed so casually had the power to dismantle everything he took for granted, and I would do it in a way he never saw coming. That night, when I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, I started to imagine what it would look like. Not just defending myself, not just proving him wrong, but turning his own world against him. His wealth, his reputation, his family. He thought I was garbage. Fine. Then I would show him what happens when the garbage refuses to stay in the can. The clock ticked past midnight, and with every passing minute, my plan started to take shape. Not fully, not yet. But like shadows gathering in the corners of a room. Richard had money, influence, connections. He believed that shielded him. What he didn't realize was that people like him always had weaknesses. They lied, they cheated, they hid secrets behind their shiny doors. And secrets, once uncovered, had the power to ruin everything. When Daniel kissed me goodnight before dropping me off, I kissed him back gently, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't thinking about love or family dinners or building a future with him. I was thinking about Richard, about the look on his face when he called me garbage, about the way his eyes had sparkled with superiority. One day I told myself he's going to regret that word, and when he does, it won't just be a word anymore. It will be the beginning of his downfall. The morning after, I did something I never thought I would. I made a list. Not the neat, color-coded lists I used for client campaigns, but a raw, furious inventory of everything Richard Langford had: assets, positions, habits, people he trusted, and everything he feared: exposure, scandal, the truth. I wrote it in the margin of a notebook while waiting for my coffee to brew. Each item a stone I could use to build a bridge from where I stood to the ruin I planned. I had Claire Reynolds's career: 5 years in digital strategy, a knack for research, a Rolodex of contacts I'd built from unpaid nights and creative wins. I had patience and the kind of calm people called cold. Daniel had his loyalty, which was both a blessing and a weakness. And Richard? He had a public image so polished it shone, and a private life as brittle as a glass ornament. Step 1 was learning everything. I started with what was easy: Richard's company, Langford Capital. Their web presence was immaculate: annual reports, philanthropic initiatives, glossy photos of board dinners. But polished pages often hide messy footnotes. I dove into press releases, SEC filings, and every article that mentioned his name. I read legal filings until my eyes blurred and watched how his smile in magazine spreads matched his signature on financial statements. Patterns emerge when you look closely: shell entities, charitable funds that didn't match donations, contracts awarded to companies with suspicious backers. Every breadcrumb led me to more breadcrumbs. There was a shell investment firm, Harrison and Pike, that had funneled money into startups which then promptly contracted with companies tied to Langford Capital. There were odd consulting fees paid to a company registered in a single-room office downtown. There were board members who knew less than they should have, and suppliers who suddenly stopped answering calls. Curious, I reached out to a reporter I admired for her reporting on corporate fraud. I didn't tell her about Richard. I asked about the kind of red flags to watch for. She sent me a list and an encouraging note. Trust your instincts. Small patterns become a case. I learned to move without making noise. I set up a burner email and a new phone number. I opened public records using my laptop and the anonymity of coffee shop Wi-Fi. I sat in traffic outside Langford Capital's headquarters more than once, watching suits come and go, noticing license plates, the timing of deliveries. Boring work, the type no one writes Mother of the Year essays about, but the backbone of every good plan. While I collected facts, I kept my life with Daniel intact. He thought I was still hurt, simmering privately. I let him hold me. I let him apologize on Richard's behalf, even though his apologies felt thin. The truth was I needed him to be unchanged. People like Daniel were predictable when left alone. They behaved how they always had. It made them easier to forecast, like tethered balloons. At home, late at night, I pieced together the ledger I'd found in a dusty corner of a corporate filing. It linked donations from the Langford Family Foundation to a community shelter, publicly lauded, while routing administrative costs through Harrison and Pike. The shelter's director was a man named Mark Ellis, who'd given speeches about compassion and equity, but Mark's payroll told another story. He subcontracted developers from a company registered to Richard's nephew. The shelter looked pure in photographs, kids laughing, volunteers baking cookies. But the money trail whispered a different story. A facility that existed mostly on paper, used as a tax write-off while real services got pennies. If this was true, then Richard wasn't just arrogant. He was a man who used suffering for profit and applause. I started to test the edges. I visited the shelter under the pretense of making a donation. The building was a converted office, far smaller than advertised. The director was polite, practiced in that way some people become after years of photo ops. My donation check cleared through a donation processor tied to an LLC whose address matched one of Langford's shell companies. I photographed everything. I took notes. I felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with Richard calling me garbage. This went deeper. This was moral. There are moments in a life when the moral and the personal collide and become indistinguishable. For me, that collision hardened my purpose. I wasn't only the woman insulted at a dinner table anymore. I was someone who had seen a pattern of exploitation and had the tools to expose it. But exposure without leverage is just shouting into wind. I needed leverage that would cut into the parts of Richard that mattered most. Reputation, board support, the glossy veneer he polished for other wealthy men. I began building a pressure map. Who sat on the boards of the charities he supported? Who benefited from his grants? Which local politicians accepted his donations? And which journalists covered his events favorably? I made a list of dinner guests whose careers hinged on Langford's approval. I noted travel schedules that would make timing an attack simple. The next move was more delicate. I couldn't just send everything to a reporter and watch it fizzle. I needed the right catalyst, someone with the resources and courage to follow the money where it led. I reached out to the reporter again, meeker this time, and hinted at discrepancies I'd noticed in public filings. Her ears perked up. She arranged for a meeting in a diner 2 blocks from my apartment. I took my notebook. I wore the same black dress from the dinner because confidence is a costume I sometimes borrow. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, sliding a small black recorder toward me. She had that look of someone who'd seen men like Richard and wanted them to fail for reasons that went beyond her paycheck. "I'm sure," I said, "but I don't want my name on anything." "Not yet," she nodded. "We can protect sources, but we need documents, paperwork." I handed her printed copies of the donations ledger, a list of shell company addresses, and photos from the shelter. She read a page or two, slow and careful, then looked up. "If this pans out, it's big. But big stories need corroboration. We'll need financial records from the firms that received Langford money. We'll need someone on the inside." Finding an insider was harder than I thought. People who take part in fraud either keep their mouths shut or they don't know that what they're doing is wrong. I tried to recruit by appealing to conscience, by appealing to self-interest. You could blow the whistle and get protection. By appealing to curiosity. Nothing. Then, through a LinkedIn thread, a mid-level accountant at one of the consulting firms reached out. She called herself Zoe. Her messages were cautious at first, encrypted, small talk. Then she slipped a line that made my heart race. "There are invoices I can't explain." "I'm scared." Zoe agreed to meet in a public place, hands shaking as she slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were scanned invoices showing payments labeled as consulting fees to companies that, on investigation, had no staff, no website, no real operations. The money moved in loops: donations to the foundation, grants to projects, fees back to companies with Langford ties. It had the shape of laundering reputational goodwill into cash. As Zoe spoke, fear and anger ran through her in equal measures. She told me how she'd found discrepancies in her firm's ledgers and had been told to ignore them. She had been promoted after complying. "I can't be the one to say anything," she said. "They'll find a way to make it look like I stole." "I won't let them put that on you," I said. "I meant it. We'll make sure the paper trail is clear, that you're protected." I sketched out contingency plans with Zoe, encrypted drives, redundant backups, a sealed envelope with copies sent to a lawyer friend, and the reporter ready to run if the documents checked out. We were not amateurs. We were careful, surgical. At night, Daniel would call and ask me if I was all right. I said I was. He wanted a future that included me, and I wanted a future that included him, but not at the cost of my integrity. The irony was delicious. Richard's contempt had set all this in motion. His dismissal of my worth spurred me into action. I could have walked away, swallowed the insult and the limp apologies, but the world was full of doors people didn't bother to open. I liked opening them. Weeks passed. Zoe delivered more invoices. The reporter dug into corporate filings and corroborated shell addresses. We fed the journalist tiny pieces of the puzzle in a way that would compel him to dig deeper without revealing how much we knew. The pressure mounted in the background, like a storm approaching the shore. I could have exposed Richard publicly in a day with what I had. But storms have an order. You want the wind to hit the house after the foundation's been undermined, not before. I wanted his friends to see that their gold statue had a hollow center. I wanted board members to feel that familiar chill when someone whispers the word liability. I wanted Richard to have time to show his hand and fail at covering it. And so I waited, setting traps of information and watching them spring in the right sequence. Each small revelation was a controlled burn, enough to alarm but not enough to extinguish the trail that led to the core. As the net closed, I found that the satisfaction wasn't in revenge itself, but in watching a system unclench the way a clenched fist opens when you remove its reason to hold tight. On a crisp autumn evening, with the city lights beginning to wink on and a threatening silence settling in my bones, the reporter sent a single line. "We're ready. Tomorrow morning." I folded my hands over the list I'd started with and smoothed the paper as if calming a wound. I thought of Richard dining that night, of the smugness he carried like a lapel pin. The next day, the world that had once insulated him would crack. The only question left was how quickly he'd blame others and how quietly his good name would fall. I slept like someone who had finished an equation. Not because I was sure I would win, but because I had done the work to make it possible. The rest, exposure, fallout, and whatever came next, depended on the truth, and on a small team of people who were finally ready to tell it. The headline hit the morning news like a bomb. Langford Capital under federal investigation for fraud and misuse of charitable funds. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from co-workers, old friends, even distant relatives. Everyone wanted to know if I'd seen it. The article ran on the front page of the Boston Globe, authored by the reporter I'd worked with. It laid everything out in painstaking detail. The shell companies, the fake donations, the fraudulent consulting fees. There were quotes from whistleblowers, financial experts, even a leaked statement from the Attorney General's office confirming subpoenas had been issued. But the part that made me sit back in bed, coffee forgotten on the nightstand, was the photo. A glossy image of Richard Langford, shaking hands at a charity gala, plastered right beneath the bold, damning headline. His smile, once a symbol of power, now looked grotesque, like a mask melting under too much light. Daniel called me before I could even finish the article. His voice was frantic, his words tumbling out. "Claire, did you see this?" My dad, God, they're saying the foundation, he swore it was legit. I don't understand. None of us knew. I listened in silence, letting him spill his panic. My heart ached for him, but I also knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. "Daniel," I said finally, calm and steady. "Your father's been lying for a long time. This isn't new. It's just finally visible." He went quiet. For once, there were no excuses, no defenses. Just silence on the other end of the line. By afternoon, news vans lined the street outside Langford's mansion. Neighbors peeked from behind manicured hedges. Board members resigned in waves, each one issuing statements about being misled and deeply troubled. Stock in Langford Capital plummeted. Politicians scrambled to return his donations. The empire Richard had built brick by brick was unraveling in front of the entire city, and yet, despite the chaos, I wasn't satisfied. Not yet, because Richard still hadn't looked me in the eye and understood that the street garbage he dismissed was the one who lit the match. 2 days later, Daniel invited me over. The Langford house was no longer the pristine fortress it once was. Reporters camped outside the gates. Windows stayed shut, curtains drawn. When I stepped inside, I was struck by how quickly wealth could curdle into decay. The air smelled faintly of scotch and stale smoke. Papers littered the polished dining table. Richard sat at the head, hunched, his once commanding posture deflated. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked up at me with a mix of suspicion and something else. Fear. "You," he said, his voice low and rough. You had something to do with this. I didn't deny it. I simply walked closer, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and met his gaze. Maybe I did. Or maybe the truth was always going to come out. Either way, Richard. This is what happens when you build a castle out of lies. His jaw tightened. He wanted to shout, to threaten me, but he couldn't, not now. Not with the walls closing in. You think this makes you better than me? He spat finally. You think destroying me proves something? I leaned down, close enough that he could see the fire in my eyes. No, destroying you doesn't prove anything. But watching you finally see me, really see me, proves everything. For the first time since that dinner, Richard had no smirk, no smug arrogance. Just a hollow man staring back at me, realizing he had underestimated the wrong woman. Daniel stood in the doorway, silent, torn between blood and love. He looked at me with eyes that carried questions he wasn't ready to ask. And I didn't offer answers. Not yet. I turned, my heels echoing as I walked out of the room, out of the house, out into the cold air buzzing with reporters' voices. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, but I kept walking. Not a word. Not a smile. Just silence, because the story wasn't mine to tell anymore. It belonged to the headlines, the courts, the people who would dissect every detail of Richard's downfall. All I had left was the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd kept my promise. The girl he called garbage had turned his empire to ashes. Weeks later, when the indictments came, Richard's name was everywhere again, but this time with words like fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. His assets were frozen. His so-called friends vanished. The mansion went up for sale. And me? I didn't celebrate with champagne. I didn't gloat. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about the victory lap. It was about the silence that followed, the moment when the world shifted and the man who once held power was left powerless. I moved forward. I built my career higher. I loved harder. I lived without apology. Because in the end, Richard was wrong about me. I wasn't garbage. I was fire, and fire doesn't ask permission to burn.